After the funeral procession had left the square, there was a confrontation between the police and the crowds. This angered the people, and suddenly they started to chant "Позор," which means shame. Such frank manifestations are very rare in the Soviet Union. Death first takes those of us who play at dying, wrote Wysocki in a poem in memory of a friend. He himself died on the 25th of July 1980. He was 42 years old. The cause of death was a heart attack, but the real reason was drinking, the Russian disease, as one of his friends would later put it. News of his death spread like wildfire through Moscow, preoccupied at the time by the Olympic Games. That very day, people started streaming to the Taganke theater to express their grief and sorrow. And at the funeral, something extraordinary happened. The night before the funeral, people had been gathering on Taganke Square to say farewell to the poet and singer. The Soviet media were silent about Wysocki's death, but people needed no official announcements or invitations to come to the funeral. It was estimated that about 100,000 people gathered at Taganke Square that day. Nothing like it had happened in Moscow in living memory. Hundreds of police and civilian guards, called нужники, were brought in to keep order. From the very beginning, there was an air of defiance on the square, and the police tried to stay in the background to avoid a confrontation. This event was not arranged by anyone. On the contrary, the authorities wanted the funeral to go unnoticed and as quietly as possible. People gathered spontaneously in a sincere expression of their feelings. Wysocki's funeral was one of the most remarkable events in the Soviet Union in recent years. It was not a revolt, but it was the closest people in Moscow had come to a spontaneous demonstration for a long time. Theater's last farewell to Wysocki, the bier was placed on the stage set for Hamlet. Thousands filed by in the morning. Not official titles, but people's recognition made you great, an admirer wrote on the guitar. And someone else had placed another card with the text, "What a pity that the wrong ones are dying." Representatives from all spheres of Soviet cultural life had come to see Wysocki off. After the funeral procession had left the square, there was a confrontation between the police and the crowds. Mounted police were ordered to clear the street. At the same time, the picture of Wysocki was removed from the theater's window, and the flowers were thrown in a sack. This angered the people, and suddenly they started to chant "Позор," which means shame. Such frank manifestations are very rare in the Soviet Union.
People are paying him tribute, but just now they took down his portrait. It wasn't even up for 5 minutes. The portrait was removed. It's also painful to see.
Why did they remove the picture?
Why? Ask the authorities.
What did your generation value Wysocki for?
What did they value? First of all, his talent. He created so much.
In what way did you feel that he was close to you?
What do you mean? I simply love him.
The confrontation on the square ended with a little victory for the people. After a while, a new and bigger portrait of Wysocki was set up in the window on the second floor, and that sparked off the applause. After an hour, that picture was taken down too, but people stayed on the square until late that night to grieve over the death of the poet. A well-known Soviet author said after the funeral that the events on the Taganke square that day had disclosed more than many books and analyses about Russia and the Russians. In the following weeks, people expressed their grief in songs and poems dedicated to Wysocki. Some well-known authors wrote articles that were never published but circulated privately. One of them ended with these words: "We often hear that we are no good, that we don't have freedom here, and that there is nothing in our stores. All this is true enough, but when you hear it so often, you are seized with despair and you think, God, what kind of people are we? Then suddenly strikes you, but we have got Wysocki, and despair gives way to hope." One of the many who wrote a song in memory of Wysocki was the poet Bulata Kujava. He was in a way Wysocki's spiritual predecessor and teacher in this genre. Agujava dedicated his song to Wysocki's widow, Marina Vladi.
Marina Vladimirovna, Marina Vladimirovna, о Володе Высоцком я песню придумать решил. Вот еще одному не вернуться домой из похода. Говорят, что грешил, что не к сроку свечу затушил. Как умел, так и жил, а безгрешных не знает природа. Говорят, что грешил, что не к сроку свечу затушил. Как умел, так и жил, а безгрешных не знает природа.
Wysocki's grave in a cemetery not far from the center of Moscow immediately became Russia's newest place of pilgrimage. People came from all over to lay flowers and pay their last respects. No one had asked them to come, and apart from one brief obituary, the Soviet newspapers remained silent about Wysocki's death. But in the days and weeks after the funeral, people from all over the country kept coming to the grave. And they have been coming ever since. In Russia, people always have loved their big poets with a passion hardly conceivable elsewhere. The close relationship between the public and the poet has deep roots in Russian culture and has survived also during the Soviet regime. Poets walked barefoot on a knife edge and cut their naked souls to ribbons, says the text on the plaque. It is a quote from one of Wysocki's songs. The Russian poet has always had an almost holy mission as a sort of a truth teller. In times of need, he can give consolation and hope. Wysocki fulfilled that role for the Russians of the 70s. After the funeral, the Taganke Theater became the place where people gathered to get to know something more about Wysocki. Everybody was busy writing down his songs. None of them had been printed, and people only knew them from tapes and handwritten copies. It became an obsession in Moscow to get hold of his songs. The poet's word has a special meaning in Russia. People's responsiveness is matched only by the authorities' suspicious attitude. The poet knows how to say what cannot be said in the open. The authorities have used different means to silence the poets. In Wysocki's case, they tried to keep him in obscurity, but his message reached the people anyhow.
Well, his songs seemed to hit the nail right on the head. He expressed, so to speak, the quintessential, the very essences of our modern lives. He illuminated all sides, good and bad. He wrote courageously, openly.
Wysocki wrote about 500 songs, but at the time of his death, not a single one had been published in the Soviet Union. Some few songs that could pass the censorship came out on singles. In the West, however, there were at least 6 LPs. His concerts were always arranged unofficially, but there was never an empty seat in the house. What was it that made Wysocki so popular?
First of all, is the truth in his songs about life. We don't get enough of that from other sources of information that we all have. The movies, radio, television, and I suppose from other people. Let's see, what else? Sincerity. His truly enormous sincerity. And a force that pierces your heart, which is impossible to explain, as with any poetry.
The reactions on Wysocki's death revealed a sensitivity that is typical for the Russians. Behind a facade that can seem cold and unapproachable, there is a deep well of emotion. People cannot hide their feelings as people, for instance, do in Scandinavia or the US. Russians are much more sentimental.
I visit his grave every day, and I've talked to older people who agree. I myself am not a very religious person, but an older man came up to me once and said, literally in these words, "There hasn't been so great a loss since the deaths of Jesus Christ and Yesenin." That's what he said, honestly. There hasn't been and won't be again. That's the first thing. And then there's the brilliance of his work. He was a man with a tremendous soul and huge heart. There's no way to sum up what all of us feel for him in our hearts. It's impossible to explain. To you or to anyone. And I don't mean to insult foreigners who now want to learn about him, but only Russians can really understand what he meant. Just as we cannot really understand the great people of your country, you cannot understand what he meant to us.
He was very Russian.
Very Russian. Extremely Russian. That's just what I mean. There is no other who has been loved this much. Not even Shukshin, or even Gagarin. It's inexpressible. Simply inexpressible. And I have to add, in spite of the tremendous love we all felt for him, there was no one among us, of all the millions of us, who could help him. And we did not help him. And we'll never get over that.
Telegrams and letters from all over the Soviet Union flooded the Taganke theater, and some of them were put up in the lobby. All age groups and social classes were represented in these messages. Wysocki's songs were known in all corners of the country, although they were never played on Soviet radio. But what was neglected by the radio was accomplished by the cassette recorder. For a long time, people kept coming to the theater to listen to Wysocki's songs.
Вдоль дороги все не так, а в конце подавно и не церковь, и не кабак, и ничего не свято, нет, ребята, все не так, ребята, эх, раз. Да еще раз, да еще много раз, да еще раз. Все не так, ребята.